if you weren't with us yesterday, what I want to do to start with is kind of recap really quickly why we were talking about bias in the media in particular. And we'll go from there and we'll see where we end up. So we reported on the story yesterday that I think came from the day before, that Minister Michael Wood had lashed out at Newstalk ZB about a perspective they put out there, not just an opinion piece, but in my opinion, disinformation, a piece of disinformation that they added to that opinion piece to make the opinion piece look even worse than it really was. Basically, Heather du Plessis-Allen had an opinion piece that she spoke onto her radio show that they then put into writing, which I think I still have here somewhere. Maybe I do. There it is. Entitled, I don't think they are being judgmental. I think they're being realistic. Basically saying that people should not want these Housing New Zealand developments to be built by them. They should complain about them and they should insist. And she literally uses the phrase, not in my backyard. So that's the piece that Heather du Plessis-Allen put out. Now, whether you think she's entitled to do that or it's okay for her to do that or an opinion's okay is one thing. Then what, I don't know whether it was a junior editor or whether it was a management decision, but someone at Newstalk ZB then tied this photo here, I was going to say if you're watching, you have to be watching, of a street in Mount Roskill that had a photo taken. It's a stock image from Getty. And the photo, if you can see my cursor going around and around it, is of an inorganic collection day. So the appearance that Newstalk ZB has put out about the story is you don't want these beneficiaries living next door to you. And if they do, look what they're going to do to the house next to you. The grass is going to be covered with rubbish. It's not a good thing to have these people living next door to you. She went on to talk about, troubles that some particular people are having with neighbours being, the neighbour who lives in a Housing New Zealand house threatened to kill the person living next door to them, allegedly. And I'm saying allegedly because to me, that's not necessarily, if it is true, a Housing New Zealand issue. It's a police issue because it's currently a crime to, threaten to kill someone. So there are other unknowns going on here, but the sum of it was that the piece that was done by Heather du Plessis-Allen was pretty anti-beneficiary in my opinion. It was painting beneficiaries with one brush. It was basically saying if they move in next door to you, they're going to attempt to murder you, they're going to cover their lawns in rubbish, they're going to be loud, they're going to be a problem, and you do not want it. Final little point. This is now the article that we're talking about, and as you can see, they have changed that image. So obviously there was a bit of kickback from Newstalk ZB, but the image was now changed. And last night, George and I talked a little bit about bias within the media and conversations that happen in the media that portray groups of people, circumstances in a certain way, inaccurately and unfairly, and what that does to us, those of us who are receiving the content. So as my camera flickers and I'm going to have to fix it, why don't I throw it over to Mahdis and David, and you're welcome just to jump in on that and share your thoughts. And and I'll go fix my camera while you guys have a chat.
So I think there's multiple issues. So that one issue is that this is clearly an opinion piece, and sometimes opinion pieces are not necessarily received by people who read them as clearly that. People read them as if they are objective reporting on a particular issue, when really clearly an opinion piece is somebody's opinion on an issue. And it even says that in the title. So this clearly is one person's opinion about state housing. And then this person's opinion obviously, comes with a political message because they have strong feelings about that, whether or not we agree with those feelings. And that is that somehow Housing New Zealand in the neighborhood of regular people, quote unquote, and then we kind of define who are regular people and who are the people who are not included in that. And the message is, you don't want that because those people are not good for your neighborhood and they're not going to be good for you. And when we attach an image to that, we kind of reinforce the opinion that's already in the piece. Yeah. And when news do that, and we are very, very realistic that that's what we do. We use images in marketing because we know it appeals to people. We use images to make something more attractive. We use images to distract from a particular issue. So when we choose an issue, it's never innocent. So choosing an issue of a picture of a house in a beautiful neighborhood with flowers and smiling faces might not reflect the content of that opinion piece. So the opinion piece is already politically loaded because it's clearly advocating for one perspective of an opinion, and then the image matches that. But often people look at news outlets, and what they think they're getting is objective pieces of information, which actually, when we think of psychology and how culture is received, images and words, those are constantly mediated. So when you put that image to that news article, you kind of reinforcing the message that the author, in this case, Heather du Plessis-Ellen, is advocating for. So I think media has obviously kind of a role to play. So opinion pieces are allowed. I think that's kind of the backbone of democracy, that people can write in and share their opinions.
Yeah.
But sometimes people read opinion pieces in, let's say in this case, this outlet or the New Zealand Herald or Stuff or whatever other outlet. And they don't realize that there's a difference between me writing in an opinion and saying, well, actually, I think George and Pat are just like really annoying people who have no idea what they're doing. And that's my opinion. Then if I write an investigative piece about, oh, these are the choices you made, this is where your money is coming from, right? Like one might be substantiated with information and data, and the other one is literally just my opinion, which could, in this case, be donuts taste better than cookies. But it's a very political message. So if we give that political message a platform and we maybe don't package that in a way that's clearly understandable to the reader, that's where we blur the lines between when is information and when does it become manipulation, or as we call it today, disinformation. Yeah. And I think that it's good to have opinion pieces in the news. It's really important to have opinion pieces to know where the public is at. But it's kind of sad to see that we're in a time where newspapers and news outlets have been saying that they're trying to do better. They're wanting to address their historical inaccuracies and their one-sidedness. And in the case of Stuff, an apology for their historical institutional racism. But then we see that newspapers continue to produce stories that are incredibly politically loaded without making that political message transparent to their readers. So we're leaving it basically up to the public to have the literacy to unpack these really overt and sometimes covert messages that are woven into pieces of opinion that are published in news outlets. So I think that's one of the things I would say. And then the other one is the framing of public housing, poverty, beneficiaries, and I don't want to lump those together. But there's a long history in which we blame people for, I think, their experiences in life. But then we also not only blame them, but we judge them. So we say somehow state housing is a bad thing. And not only is state housing a bad thing, people who live in state housing are also bad people, which I think that's a bigger story for us to unpack. Why is that really, really problematic and harmful? But I'll give David some space to talk to this particular issue of poverty bashing.
And also I guess at some point want to maybe think of why that term media bias as a concept is maybe inadequate for analyzing things like this beneficiary bashing or the political sort of agenda of the news.
Yeah, I mean, it's like these big media outlets just hand over their space, hand over their status, hand over their platforms for horrible right-wing people to just go on these rants, and then that is supposed to be what counts as news. I mean, I remember I'm old enough to remember when newsreaders first started emoting about what they were reading. They weren't just reading the news. They were, Judy Bailey would have a smiley face if there was something they liked and a frowning face if there was something they didn't. And I thought, just read us the news, And then, I mean, that was bad enough anyway because the news was always conservative. But now this line between just opinion and editorializing, you know, in the name of free speech or whatever. And, you know, this is what passes for news now. It really is quite shocking. And if you look at the sorts of themes, you know, I mean, how often do you get these stories about somebody who's 25 who's got a property portfolio or something like that, you know, like, and of course being that if you had done what this smart person did, you could too. You know, remember we used to have all of those sorts of things, and now we get back into this attacking the poor. And it's, you know, I have flashbacks to the Bolger years, you know, and Ruth Richardson years and stuff, which was really, really horrible. You know, it was right at the point where, because when National won in 1990, the consequences of neoliberalism and the loss of jobs and all that turmoil was just kind of starting to kick in. And then they put the unions to the sword with the Employment Contracts Act and stuff. And then very soon after, it was 1991, their first or second budget was the mother of all budgets. And, you know, cuts in benefits and cuts in taxes. And they were permanent, you know, those taxes have never gone back up again. And neither of those benefits, a massive thing. And at the same time, there was this, at the same time as, you know, the neoliberal restructuring of the economy was really impacting a whole lot of people in a really harsh way and impacting their standards of living. We were being encouraged to dump on these people and to hate these people. You know, we had the Dob and the beneficiary campaign. We had, you know, the thing that National and Winston Peters did, the Code of Social Responsibility. You know, it was like the people who have had the biggest kicking in this whole neoliberal onslaught are the ones that we're supposed to be hating on. You know, the Code of Social Responsibility was like, oh, these poor people, yeah, never mind that they're on benefits because the jobs are all being lost because of economic policies that they never supported. If they're getting this, like they're getting something from free, you know, the bludgers and all the rest of it. It's like, and so, you know, if you're getting something, we get things back in return. And so with that whole the Code of Social Responsibility, like you owe us, we're giving you this little bit of money, so you owe us. And that whole kind of hatred of the poor, and that was the 1990s. And you look at how much the gap between rich and poor has widened since then. The numbers of people that are just way below, and, you know, with property and all the rest of it, have just got no chance of catching up. Cost of accommodation, cost of living is just like another turning of the screws of people who are already down there. And now we get this, you know, scummy people that we wouldn't want to have living next to us. It's really gross, eh? It really is disgusting. And she was the one. What was that thing she said about Pacifica people?
Leeches. She called them leeches.
Yeah, I mean, what
like,
a piece of shit.
We I think what we see is that news outlets, not just news, I think any kind of information we consume also shapes public opinion, right? So if you're constantly bombarded with imagery and comments and slogans, and I'm just thinking of, you know, 2003 and weapons of mass destruction. The US kept saying weapons of mass destruction, and it didn't matter if there were weapons of mass destruction. People felt that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So I think we're seeing something very similar. By constantly repeating the same political messages, we are shaping people's public opinion who might not know otherwise. So if you're tapping into the fears of people, saying, well, you live in a really good neighborhood and you love your family and you love your neighbors, and then suddenly these unwanted, undesirable people could come in and they're getting something that they didn't work for. They're just getting it for free. And not only are they getting it for free, they're also going to be really noisy and dirty in your neighborhood. You might not want that. that's not just one bad message from one person. It's tapping into a history of a talk like that, right? I guess David is saying, like, this idea of us blaming the poor for poverty has actually a much longer trajectory, right? So I think and that's what it does. And it's not saying, oh, here is disinformation. This is not new. I mean, political messages work like that, but we also can't say, oh, I didn't mean to. I am just stating my opinion as if my opinion exists in a vacuum. No, it's not. When you put something on the into an outlet that people think is giving them some kind of an objective piece of information that's verified and double checked and so forth, and they're getting that from multiple sources, that's going to shape their opinion. And that's what it is. It's designed to do that. An opinion piece is designed to shape opinion. It's designed to manipulate you to move from where you are into another direction. And it clearly works, because not only does the information in the article manipulate you towards a certain, like, come with me in this direction, but the images also do that. And they do that very, sometimes like very explicitly and very subtly. I think I can give another example that something I've been noticing is with the outbreak of monkeypox. Particularly in Europe, everybody's really alarmed by, monkeypox outbreak in Europe and Australia. But the images that you see is often of African people, right? Or when people try to raise money for Save the Children to support some lunch program somewhere down the street, they use they use images of people who are not people that live down the street. So we kind of tap into people's expectations, and we manipulate into a specific direction, right? It's designed to sway opinion.
Yeah, let me throw this in there as well, because talking about the imagery, the other thing we mentioned yesterday based on this article was what Minister Michael Wood had said, because I agree with you about opinion pieces. Opinions are like arseholes. Everyone's got one. And opinions put out there is an opinion putting out there. But when ZB then amplified it with the imagery, that's what Michael Woods had a problem about. With respect, the only trash here is the crude stereotyping of state housing communities. I recognise this image. It's a street I know well in the middle of Mount Roskill. Proud, decent people who now have an image of inorganic collection day being used to create an impression that they are lazy, messy and antisocial. Of course, genuinely bad behaviour needs to be managed by the landlord, but this sort of inaccurate scaremongering, and I would say disinformation, I think it was done on purpose obviously, is just about stirring nasty class politics and cliques. We'll keep building the houses our family needs. Following on for that, George, when we were talking about this yesterday, we haven't shown this yet, but George has also got some imagery just to kind of expand what the media is doing, talking about state housing. George, do you want to show that as well? And the idea being, like, we're talking about state houses and they get the worst possible images they can to represent the state houses. So the imagery is going out to, TVNZ, it's 500,000 people. And if you watch this, this is what you think state houses look like.
Yeah, I like this one. It's from the One News budget reporting when the budget came out. But I like this one because it's an example of when it's more subtle. The narrator talks about putting money in places where there's a shortage of houses, but as we'll see, the visuals are very different.
Caps have been lifted to meet the recent dramatic house price increases, and a $350 million housing fund to build affordable rental housing in some of the areas with the biggest shortages.
And my question to George was, why don't they, if they're going to show state houses, why don't they show these ones? Beautiful, manicured, well-kept, probably made with native timber, the state houses that look utterly gorgeous. Why don't they show one of the new developments of state houses, apartment buildings that if you saw that on a brochure, you might want to buy it. So I think we just wanted to echo, and although you guys have already talked about it, that the imagery that's getting put out there creates or engenders a thought in some people that, look at this. This is these people are in state houses, so they must be dirty and filthy and bad. And look at their gates. They must have tagging all over their gates. It's the only way these people can live.
Because where the discussion inevitably goes is that, like, even a positive, so-called positive portrayal of this is just as constructed and possibly just as politically motivated as a negative view. For example, you know, I might have a crushed up can of Woodstock in my backyard, right?
Probably do.
Like, and yeah, exactly.
I mean,
Like,
you go
who gives
past
a
the
fuck?
street in Dunedin and you would think you're in a war zone. I think it creates an image of deserving and undeserving people, right? So it creates an image of desirable and undesirable. I have a problem with that because even people whose backyard might be full of, old furniture are deserving. I think that's one problem that I see. Like, a house doesn't have to be perfectly nice looking with a manicured garden for the people who live in it to be deserving of a dignified life. But what we often see is that these images create these distinctions between hardworking and not hardworking. Organized and unorganized, lazy and productive people. And I think this notion of production is a really important one as well. But then it also really creates fundamentally this distinction between some people deserve and some people don't deserve. And we do that. We create populations of people that we categorize as disposable, undeserving people. Whether we do that because like they aren't working, or we do that because they don't belong to the right social class or ethnic group or sexual orientation, but we constantly creating categories of undeserving, deserving, and undeserving people. I would say any news outlet is political. Everything is political. It's just about understanding to read the political messages correctly, like having political literacy, having media literacy. It's very naive of us to say that things don't have an orientation. The moment you put your camera on this angle, there's something else that is not in the picture. But this is deliberate, right?
Yeah.
Like this is a deliberate message that's being sent, and this is a deliberate picture that was chosen, whether or not the person was fully aware. And I think that's when people revert to the notion of bias, which I don't find quite useful, because it kind of assumes everything happens on an individual level, and it happens deep down inside of you, and you're not fully conscious of your choices.
Right.
But this political climate that we have created that makes poor people undeserving is not a bias problem, is a systemic problem. This bias that stuff reported about institutionally being racist against Maori in their reporting is not something somebody, oops, I did not realize that. Those are some political forces that are very willful, even if the individual who made that choice wasn't aware of the willful nature that's behind them. So I think that's why I sometimes find the word bias a little, it falls short.
So
Yeah,
can I ask you this, Mahdis, rather than, because I'm thinking about, we hear quite often subconscious bias. Like if that editor or whoever it was at News Talk ZB found that photo and that, oh, what a great photo of a group of state housing, and rather than saying, if it wasn't a deliberate choice, rather than saying it would be a subconscious bias, how would you reference it? Well, if that's not necessarily a helpful word, bias, what is it? How would you talk about it?
I think the word can be helpful. As I
Yeah.
said, I think I said that just before we went live. Sometimes you shouldn't chuck out the baby with the bathwater. It can be helpful, but some of these entrenched views are much more systemic, and bias refers to something that happens inherently at an individual level. So
Right.
we don't have structural inequality like poverty because Mahdis, tend to make some mean choices in life against David as an individual. There's a whole history, of, and I would say, neoliberal policies, capitalism as a whole, probably, the dismantling of what the housing market is. And I know that actually a lot of people who go and are trained in communications and are trained as journalists, they're taught that, because fundamentally part of journalism school is to learn about propaganda, to know the distinction between how you report on something and how something becomes propaganda. So we know that people are actually taught that these things, and they would know it. They do detect it really quickly, because when any other minority asks for something, they're like, ooh, there's an agenda, right? Women ask for something, there's some kind of agenda. Maori ask for, anything in this country, there's an agenda. But there's an agenda when we say that we don't want state housing, and this is what people in state housing are supposedly categorically all like, right? So I think this is where I find the word bias falls short, because it disregards these other bigger ideas that are already there before an individual can make maybe an accident, maybe a poor choice or something.
So in a nutshell, that for the simple guy in the room, an inherent or subconscious bias more talks about what I have, but the reason that editor chose that image is likely because he went, oh, this makes sense because of days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries of this mis and disinformation. So it's not about him, it's about the systemic issue around him that says, well, that image fits properly because this is what the beneficiary image should be, not rather his own personal. Yeah.
They reached for a cliche.
Yeah.
Cliche image, but there's reason it's a cliche image. And when you're in a position of authority and influence in a media outlet like that, you got to understand what are the politics of reaching for a cliche like that in this sort of context, and what that actually means, And Mahdis is talking about deserving and undeserving and all the rest of it. Though the sort of underlying thing, I think, is that one of the consequences, whether deliberate or not, is it's telling the viewer that these people we're talking about are not like us. They make it look as kind of gross as they can, and so there's a disconnect. So instead of people feeling, that could be me or some kind of empathy, it's like, oh, this is what's going on here, and there's this kind of disconnect between, you don't see those people as your fellow citizens who are
the other.
Maybe that's right. They are.
Yeah.
They totally are.
Yeah. Matthew says on the messaging as well that discrimination is built into the system. So I guess that's sort of what we're talking about. I was thinking of a couple of things. The first thing. Oh, sorry, you go.
Can I give I feel like some examples are a little bit more vivid.
Sure.
So I love like Dunedin Castle Street savagery, which was, I had never seen anything like it. But when you see images of how media portrays protest, and when people protest and protest disrupts into some form of rioting or destruction of property, that is always at the forefront of how media reports on demonstrations against usually, social ills that happen. And it says, oh, people are rioting. So now I don't know if people have ever gone to big sporting events when their favorite team wins, or end of year university celebrations. There's some really serious damage of public property that happens. People are, completely drunk, and there's a lot of rioting that happens. But we don't frame that as, oh, here's the societal ill that's coming at us. Oh, it's going to destroy our way of life. So we have the capacity to frame information in ways that makes it understandable to the viewer, and we also have the capacity to frame information in a way that alienates and makes the reader feel disconnection and removal, and in some ways rejection of what is being reported. So I don't like the idea of disinformation, because I think that's really deliberate.
Yeah.
The purpose of this piece is state housing is bad, and I want as many people as possible to realize it's bad, and it's bad because I think these people don't deserve it. This is not me trying to package some hidden message. It's really in your face. It couldn't be clearer. Okay? It's framing it as people are being reasonable. People who don't want state housing in their backyard are not judgmental. They're not being classist. They're not being exclusivist. They're just being reasonable, concerned citizens. It's quite interesting. I think it's the way it says that. It's very obvious. It says, we are different. We have certain values. These people, whoever these people are, because it's never really clear. I'm telling you, they're kind of a threat to your lifestyle, to your neat little picket fence, nuclear family lifestyle.
Who would want them next door?
Yeah,
exactly. And you're an idiot if you want them next door.
Yeah.
Look, I was gonna kind of wrap this part of the conversation thinking about what do we do from here. Like, I do like to try and finish these sorts of conversations with like a where to from here. What can we do? How can we affect or be a part of the solution to what this issue is? Is there anything?
Well, I think first of all, I think media outlets are really important to democracy. Having independent media that reports on things is a backbone to like a lot of things that happen. But by diversifying our outlets and making sure that we don't only have these few, being transparent about how things are funded, I think is also a really good way. And yeah, I just find like literacy is really important. Being able to decipher things that are in front of us, because I can read this opinion piece and I see something completely different than maybe somebody else, right? And part of that is my political orientation. Part of it is my training, but it's making those things transparent. Having good, solid media, I think, is another one. I think I think one of the things that I see is that we're moving away from good journalism to quick, easy clickbait. Has to be fit into a really short amount of words so that people can engage it. But sometimes complex things require more than 140 characters. I think just having, I don't know, like I'm not so good on solutions. I'm like way more better at like pointing out problems and things.
I always feel like it's sorry, David, just quickly. I always feel like it's a political thing. It's a looking for solutions sort of thing to think about this theoretically like we have. And I think if you look at bias as an inadequate concept, as one that, if we use that concept, then really people are sort of like, oh, it's just an innate bias or it's some sort of natural, unchangeable thing.
Yeah.
If we see it as something that's maintained through how the media, for example, anchor their stories with images, if we see how it's produced, then that's political in itself, right? That makes it possible to see solutions.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that this discussion about trying to analyze and make sense of what's going on in the media is really important, because we are in interesting times here. I mean, and a discussion of the media right now is different from what it would have been 5 years ago, and from what it will be in 5 years' time. There's changing things, and it's interesting, the whole convoy crowd and all that, and the MSM, they're all on about the mainstream media, and it's like, because none of those people were ever into politics before. They're all only just discovered it. It's pretty obvious. It's like they've suddenly realised that the mainstream media is doesn't kind of tell you the truth, but they honestly think that like Jacinda Ardern controls what the media plays, what the media publishes, and crazy stuff like that. But there is at least, I suppose, a skepticism about what is kind of going on there. But even just on the basics of liberal democracy, the fourth estate is supposed to be an important part of society, and ever since the sort of the technological and business changes that have happened that have kind of gutted mainstream media, we've been left high and dry. We used to complain about bad editorials and all this kind of stuff, and now it's just got kind of worse and worse, because as the daily newspaper used to make its money from all the advertising, and then they would use the advertising money to employ journalists to write the news stories, and then Trade Me turns up and Ali Express turns up, and suddenly all the advertising revenue's gone and the business model falls over. And so the gutting of the journalistic workforce, even though you could be critical of how critical and inquiring the journalists were, was at least a journalistic workforce and outlets to publish that sort of stuff. And now it's like there are big influential outlets that are becoming more and more, this kind of clickbait, opinion-oriented stuff. We haven't quite got the whole Murdoch phenomenon going here, as you find in Australia and the US and so on, and Fox News and so on. But we're heading in that direction, and it's. Sorry, this was the solution part, wasn't it? I'm struggling into more piles of shit here, I'm afraid.
Hey, well, no, look, I've got an idea for it. I mean, I've got an idea for a solution, because people in the chat are talking about Murdoch as well. Carl says how bad this could be if we had Murdoch media driving public discourse. If TVNZ are showing negative image, how can we change this? And then Matthew again says, living in Australia and watching election, it was insane watching the Murdoch media at work. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I saw a report, something like the 11 major dailies or something in Australia were all supporting the Conservatives and coming out for them in the days leading up to it. Maybe a small solution, and maybe I'm being naive here, is when we see this, we get on the blower or get on the Twitter or get on the Facebook of TVNZ and go, hey, that's not how all beneficiaries live. You could choose to have different imagery if you wanted to. I mean, it may not make an effective change, but at least it could be something that we could do.
Yeah, but I also think that something on a macro level is to have real actual public engagement around the privatization of something like media and the undervaluing of journalists. If a journalist is required to tweet 40 tweets a day, write 2 blog posts, and then do an investigative piece to get their salary, we have to be realistic of how good the journalism is going to go, and if people also constantly want to be entertained. So I think that we can have these small step solutions that are about what are the things that we can do as the public. But then there has to be a bigger question around how did this happen in the first place? How did we get here, and how do we revert back to something else? And I think those are not either or. They're simultaneous things that could be done, and like different people will be able to do different things.
And there's an obvious part of the solution happening right now, with this show you guys are putting on. This is, generating our own media, other people's media with alternative perspectives. And, you don't get the coverage of that the Herald does or TVNZ does, but you can still, make quite good inroads. And people need to be able to hear the sort of perspectives and voices you put on this show.
Last thing we'll do on this before we move on, Carl again says the Public Journalism Fund was set up to boost diverse voices in reporting, but according to Sean Plunkett, it shouldn't exist if they can't make money. It's a catch-22. Now, I just wanted to speak to that because I did a podcast with Sean Plunkett at the end of last week, and respectfully, I challenged Sean Plunkett on, he's got a model that's not making money at the moment, and he took money from a private investor. So what's the difference in getting funded from the government and then making content, or getting funded by millionaires in Tauranga and then getting content? So respectfully to Sean Plunkett, he's doing exactly what he's criticizing others of doing from. He's just taking it from a different pool of money. And he says it's going to be viable and it's going to be ongoing, and that might be true. And I guess I hope it is, because I want businesses to succeed. But at the moment, the platform is running off money. It's not charitable officially, but money given to them. Like the ODT, some of their stuff is running off money given to them. Yes, by the government. Yes, by private investors. So with the greatest respect to those supporting Sean Plunkett and what he's doing, I don't see it as that different as taking money from the public coffers, taking it from a private business. It's still taking money from someone else with some strings attached, in my opinion.
And I think it's very different taking money from government than taking money from private investors, because the accountability process is is a huge difference between that. And the transparency around where money comes from and how it's used is also very different. It's different if I get money from the government to run a podcast than if I get money from Elon Musk to run a podcast. There's a huge difference between that. And, like, money isn't just money. And it's also not like grandma that gives it to you for Christmas and you can do whatever the heck you want with that. Money always comes with strings attached.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'd rather want the strings attached to be transparent and for the public to have a say on them, which, if you live in a democracy, is easier with government than it is with a billionaire that is a private person.